So what I'm talking about today is the dark web, and of course everybody knows all about what it is, so I'll skip over any real, I'm going to dive into things a little bit, but there's a lot of aspects to the dark web, and just based on timing, I'm really just going to talk today about the sort of the concept of users and identity of users, and the fact that it's been stolen, it's being sold out on the dark web today. So where does the problem come from? Where are we seeing the issues? Well, a lot of it, of course, unfortunately, is everybody in this room and most of your employees. The issue is our users. So if you look at passwords and the way we manage passwords, from a recent survey, about 39% of the people that were surveyed used the same password or very similar passwords. So we see a lot of patterns in the passwords, especially when we see them, when we look at collections of passwords from users that get stolen and they get made available on the web. 39% of adults, which is great, except 49% of our millennials. So almost half the millennials have an even bigger problem where they're using those passwords over and over. If you look at where the breaches, we keep talking about breaches, companies getting broken into, more and more we hear about new breaches every day, and at the same time when we look at what's causing those breaches, in about 80% of the cases, it's caused by a password that was stolen from somebody. So it's caused by either a weak password or no password. In some cases, it's caused by manufacturers, unfortunately, who want to rush to market. We're just talking about IoT, and if you look at the flood of IoT devices that have come out, a lot of them are being shipped from the manufacturer with hardware passwords embedded, and so they can't be changed, and so things like the Mirais. So we're seeing a lot of issues like that. So this is where passwords just become a real challenge. They become a really easy backdoor, if you will, into the systems. 85% of the business with 1,000 employees, again from the same survey, less than 1,000 employees, based on sort of looking at forensics and then just looking at the way the trends are happening around breaches. A lot of companies don't even know they've been breached. So somebody's been in their systems looking around or unfortunately taking things or causing damage, and in a lot of cases they don't know about it until after the fact. We had Noel Biderman here a few years ago who stood, I think, likely on this stage and talked to us about how security, and we asked him at that time, one of the questions was, what do you do, what are you guys doing at Ashley Madison to think about security and plan for security? And he said, we don't really think about it too often. He said, it doesn't really come up that much in our conversations, and besides, we don't have anything that anybody wants anyways. And we know, 2 months later, they were already likely breached at that point, and 2 months later, the breach became public, and 3 months later, he didn't have a job. So we know that there's real impacts. It's a bigger company, obviously. Billions of credentials for sale on the dark web. Billions of, 85 million what we call PII, personally identifiable information. That could be your home address, your home details. It could be your social insurance number. It could be your credit card information. But there's a lot of information that's being sold and for sale and for trade on the dark web itself. And the final point, and I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes, about 30% of compromise, especially when we see system accounts. So think of a system account as maybe it's the service account that runs your Exchange server, or it's an account that's being used as an administrator account to manage the network. About 30% of the accounts that we look at that have been compromised, 2 years later, they still have the exact same password. So when we go to do testing on those, we still see the exact same password in place. And so we spent a lot of time, there's been a lot of work done, which I think a lot of you have likely contributed to, working with your users, reminding them to change their password every 90 days, or getting them to use more complex passwords, but most companies aren't changing their system passwords. And so again, it's just another source of breach. So just quickly, what is the dark web? There's sort of three pieces to the internet. There's what we call the public web, or we also refer to it as the surface web, and that's the part of the internet that most of us use every day. It's where we surf, it's where we use Google, find information. There's something called the deep web, and again, a lot of the organizations here today would have deep web information, and the definition of the deep web is information that's on the internet, but it's not searchable, it's not available through a Google. So think of a TD Canada Trust website. I go and I log in, the information that I'm accessing would be considered to be on the deep web. Or again, I host cybersecurity information. So if that comes to me securely, it's obviously not being indexed by Google, so that would be on the deep web. And then finally, the piece that, of course, we're going to talk about today is what we would call the dark web, and that's not really readily available for most people. Most people, you can't just go to a website, you can't put an IP address in, you can't type in a URL, you need to use a special browser, you need to access it in a different way. So it's really hidden. In almost all cases, they're hidden. You can go on the internet and do some searches, and you may find some information out about the dark web, but you can't necessarily access things just by, again, typing things in. Certainly not from a search engine. In almost all cases, you cannot access it from a regular web browser, so you have to use something called a Tor browser, which is basically a browser that has special connections built into it, proxies, if you will. And what that allows you to do is you would connect here, for example, from Collingwood, and it's going to route you to a location halfway around the world, and then your connection's going to come out, and from that point, you're going to do whatever it is you're doing to connect to, underground sites, if you will. But from a tracking point, the reason they do that is so that the FBI, CIA, NSA can't really track the original source. So it bounces around through multiple Tor locations throughout the world. So the goal, again, is to keep those connections hidden. And of course, the dark web really is a bazaar. Anything and everything is for sale. So I think I have a slide here. This is a nice slide that RSA put out this year, just talking about the typical prices to buy different types of information. So you want to buy information about people that have made retail purchases, consumer information, travel and leisure, social, obviously the social instant messaging, emails, things like that. You can buy all kinds of credentials, all kinds of account information on the dark web. And again, typically it's for sale, or in a lot of cases it's for trade. So what they're doing is that bad guys are trading with other bad guys. They have a collection of accounts, and they'll give you a collection of accounts, and in return they get a collection of accounts from you. So they're using these accounts, obviously, for different types of hacking activity. So as I mentioned before, people are our greatest strength, but unfortunately, of course, they also become our greatest weakness, right? So just quickly, some of the ways that dark web data ends up on the dark web. Phishing, which I hope everybody in the room is familiar with. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but that's the idea. People get an email, and they click on a link in the email, and it asks you to provide some information. And of course, you think that it's a legitimate site. You provide the information, and voila, the hacker has your information. Malvertising, well, things that we think are legitimate advertisements, they pop up. The ad networks especially have been infected many, many times with basically malware, where legitimate advertising shows up, people install it. If you think about our browsers, they have the ability to set a lot of times for things to run automatically, or to be prompted, or just not to run. For convenience sake, a lot of people just set it to run automatically, and so you don't even need to click on anything when you go to some of the websites. It just downloads it automatically. Watering holes, just like the animals gather around the watering holes, or we gather around the watering coolers, looking at sites, social media especially, where a lot of people are coming to gather information. Hacker breaks into one of the sites, is able to install some malware there, and then everybody who's going to that site is certainly picking it up. And then finally, it's the direct web attacks. I'm breaking into Bell's 3 million accounts stolen from Bell, right? That's all for sale on the dark web today. So the web attacks, the direct ones, are obviously where we're getting the huge repositories of information, but the individual attacks are where there's a lot more success. There's a lot more information that gets in. Before I go any further here, is Jeff Weiner in the room? There's Jeff. So Jeff was very nice. I put him on the spot, and I asked him if he would mind if I did a very focused dark web search on his company's domain to see if there were any credentials out on the dark web. Does anybody want to take a guess about how many credentials we found? I'm going to show you. So I wish I could say it was 0. It was not 0. Any guesses? So we found 28 records, and I've just got a subset of some of the records here so that you can see them to give you some ideas of the accounts themselves. But there's some interesting things here. Most recently, only 2 weeks ago, basically, an account was called PayPal at digicom.ca showed up on the dark web. There's some guy with the initials JW. We don't know who it is yet. We haven't got enough details, but we're investigating further. He actually showed up, I think, 4 or 5 times over the list. Now, you'll notice this list, the dates go back quite a bit further. And so you say, well, some of these are quite a bit older, so why does it matter? Well, it still matters because, again, I see an admin account down here. Remember I mentioned before about the fact that a lot of the system accounts, even though the account's older, the password's older there, it's still likely, it may still be active. We obviously didn't test it, but it could very well be active. I obfuscated the passwords for some of them, and then some of the passwords, when we get them off the dark web, they're actually hashed. They're basically encrypted, and so it doesn't show up as a default here. You have to run it through an algorithm just to turn it back into a proper password. But you can also see some of the sources where they came from. So the passwords at the top are being sold on an ID theft forum, and then some of the other ones have been pulled from different web pages. So they're actually websites that are compromised where information is being stolen. So bad people have your data, so what do you do now? Do you give up? Well, no, of course. What can they do with it? Certainly sending spam is very common, so I get access to the account, I use it, I set up a Gmail account, or I log into Gmail and I can send spam using it. I can make changes to websites. So I could potentially log into a website, make some changes, put my own malicious content online, and continue the process, keep on going, right? Installing malware. I can compromise other accounts with the same credentials. What do I mean by that? Well, if I have your password here, going back to my previous slide where we talked about 39% of the people using the same password or similar passwords, I could use your account, even though this may not be your account where this password came from, I can start to see patterns. So I look and I say, well, how does JW create his password here? His password here is, Ashley123. And I can hit social media. Lots of people don't really lock their accounts down. And I get an idea, what are the kids' names? What are the wife's names? What's the dog's name? What's the cat's name? So you start to look through, you get an idea of what patterns people are using, because again, humans are creatures of habit and we're lazy. So we end up in a lot of cases using very similar passwords, even though we might change it slightly in different locations. It's pretty easy to figure out. Or even worse, we just use the same password, which I know I've done this. I did this exercise with a group of trustees, bankruptcy trustees, about 2 weeks ago. And I pulled up their domain live. And all the information was there. And even though you could only see the first four letters, one of the guys points up and he says, Fred, you're using Sheila's password? As you know, because it was S-H-E-I was the first four letters. So of course, everybody knew his wife's was Sheila. So, again, we end up using the things that we're comfortable with, things that we know, and it's a real problem, obviously. What else can happen, of course, sensitive data is the thing that scares us the most, right? Somebody breaks in and steals our information, or even worse, steals our customers' information, steals our IP. And of course, the final thing that can happen is that idea of identity theft, right? Where somebody's using your information and they're doing something with it that you really don't want them. So from a good point, it's not all bad news, because that data that's out there, you can actually use it to help, right? You've got this concept, if you think about it, and I'd sent that information to Jeff a few weeks ago so that he could at least see it when he agreed to let me use it ahead of time. So you can use this information. So you can see which accounts have been compromised. You can see what information is being sold out on the dark web or traded on the dark web, and you can use it, get people to change their passwords. The fact that you can see the passwords also helps you understand if there are some people who maybe need some education or awareness around using more difficult passwords or reusing the same types of passwords, especially when you see the same account over a period of time and they're using the same password or something very similar, which we see on a regular basis, right? Leaked credentials don't mean you've been compromised. It means a user has gone somewhere and provided data that they shouldn't have, or it means that something like a Bell Canada got breached. The Bell Canada breach is a good example where all of the data that got breached, people think, well, how can my corporate account have anything to do with Bell Canada? Because it was Bell that got breached. Well, what happens with Bell Canada? You go in, you set up an account, you get your bell.ca, and they ask you for an alternate email address. Most people only have their home internet, so they'll have Rogers or Bell, and then they have their corporate address, so they give their work address. Well, now, even though Bell got compromised, I don't have your corporate password, but I do have your corporate email address associated with that account, and I have the password that you were using at Bell. Once again, back to my using same and similar passwords, now I have a pretty good place to start if I wanted to start the target. Obviously, look for patterns. If you see a whole bunch of things show up on the dark web all at once, which happened recently, there was just a flood of breaches that happened, and there was a lot of new information that showed up. You can use that information to educate your users, and you can also use it when you start to see common things happening. It may be indicative of somebody targeting you, so rather than just being an individual thing. So what can you do? Finally, educate your users, as I mentioned before. That's, I think, one of the most fundamental things is that we as users of the network need to realize that this information could be used, and it could be used against us. Regular password changes. The NIST, for those who are familiar with NIST, it's an organization out of the States. They recently published an interesting paper where they basically said, stop forcing users to use complex passwords, stop forcing users to change their password every 90 days, but start to teach users about using passphrases. And so a passphrase would be it could be a line from a poem, or it could be the start of a few different words in a sentence. But the idea is to have a much longer password, because when it comes to cracking the passwords, the length is actually far more important than the complexity of the password. And forcing the users to change it all the time, it's again, we've said it's good practice for years. The reality is they're saying maybe it's time for a change. Think about how that data could be used in your business. One of the areas where we use data from dark web searches is we do cybersecurity monitoring for a bunch of companies. And so we're watching for activity on their network. Well, by taking these accounts and looking for specific activity related to these accounts, I can flag that and give it a higher priority, because perhaps somebody's doing, oh, there's my timer. Somebody's doing something specifically that's targeted at me. And if it's focused specifically on those accounts, the odds are good that they've gone to the trouble of going to the dark web, downloading my data, and they're actually trying to do something specifically as it relates to me. Data, every piece of data has value to somebody. So somebody's interested in the information that you have pretty much can guarantee it. And my final point that I say all the time is make sure you secure it before you regret it. Thank you very much.